Well, thank you all for being here tonight. We really appreciate your coming on our very special History Revealed for Indigenous Peoples Day. We are honored to have Linda LeGarde Grover, but before we introduce her, I want to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe from the East Side Freedom Library.
Thank you, Robin, and welcome everyone to what will certainly be another great conversation around History Revealed. We're delighted that you've joined us. We want to mention that the next History Revealed will feature Eric Dragney and his book Vikings in the Attic. We'll see what that. How do they get into the attic with those big horns on and stuff? We will find out. But we're delighted that you're with us and hope that you had a chance to enjoy the extraordinary weather today and in your own ways observed Indigenous Peoples Day. And I will turn things over to my colleague, Robin Priestley from Ramsey County Historical Society, who will introduce Linda and say a little bit about the ground rules of how we will manage this evening to maximize the quality of presentation so that we can record it well and get more people involved in the conversation. Robin?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for being here tonight. I want to again thank the East Side Freedom Library and the Roseville Library for their support and partnership with all of our History Revealed programs. And please remind you that to purchase titles, this title, as well as all the other books from our History Revealed series, please see our partner at Subtext Books, which is subtextbooks.com. And we'll put a link in the chat for their website for Gichigami Hearts by Linda LeGarde Grover. It's a beautiful book, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation. But again, before we get into that, I just want to thank all of you who are supporters and friends of the Ramsey County Historical Society and the East Side Freedom Library. These programs are made possible by your support, and you can find out about both organizations as well as the Ramsey County Library on our websites, which are on the screen in front of you. And as Peter mentioned, as a reminder, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off during the program. It will be recorded. So after Linda has had a chance to speak, you can put your questions in the chat. And then if you'd like to share something, we will turn off the recording and allow people to turn on your microphones and cameras after the program is over. So the recording will be up on our YouTube channels in a few days. It will take us a little bit to get it up, but again, if you've missed part of this or you just want to share it, please check out our YouTube channels for the Ramsey County Historical Society and the East Side Freedom Libraries. We would like to acknowledge this sacred Dakota land, Misaabekong, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands, especially on this very special Indigenous Peoples Day. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other Indigenous peoples. And you can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, that's www.rchs.com. And that includes actionable ways in which RCHS pledges to honor the Dakota and other Indigenous peoples of Minnesota, Mekoche, including programs like this. We are committed, and the East Side Freedom Library is also committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community. And we're so pleased to bring you tonight's program, which is part of our Making Minnesota series, which is exploring those untold stories, histories, and experiences of some of the worldwide immigrant, African-American, and Indigenous communities that make up Ramsey County, which is the most diverse county in our state of Minnesota. So I want to thank our speaker this evening for coming tonight on a very special day to honor her ancestors and sharing her beautiful book. It is a wonderful book. I'm so glad that I had a copy and was able to read it. It was just, it was very touching. I really don't have words. It was a beautiful book. Linda LeGarde Grover is Professor Emeritus of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth and a member of the Bois Forte Band of Ojibwe. Her books, The Road Back to Sweetgrass, Onigamiising, Seasons in a Ojibwe Year, and In the Night of Memory, all from Minnesota, have earned numerous awards, including the Native Writers Circle of the Americas First Book Award, the Northeastern Minnesota Book Awards for Poetry, Memoir, and Fiction, and a Minnesota Book Award for Memoir and Creative Nonfiction. Linda's book of stories, The Dance Boots, was the winner of the Flannery O'Connor Award and the Janet Heidinger Kafka Prize. So thank you, Linda.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here, and thank you to everyone who is with us. We're virtual people here this evening. I'm really honored to be asked to speak on this day and to talk about some of the research I've done and my own family and community histories up here in northern Minnesota. I am a member of the Bois Forte Band, which is, if you've heard of Net Lake, that is another word that's used up there. It is, the Bois Forte lands are north of the Iron Range in Minnesota. So the Net Lake lands, the reservation lands in the village are, it's 19 miles west of Orr, Minnesota. If you're going up 53, and then the Vermilion part of the reservation lands is right across Lake Vermilion from Tower, Minnesota, on the shores there. And my grandmother was from north of Vermilion there, up in the wilds, I guess you'd say. And my grandfather was from Fond du Lac, which is those are reservation lands just southwest of Duluth. And they met at boarding school, which, might sound like kind of a romantic little story. And I guess you could say that it is. They were both students there, but my grandmother was a little older than him. And when she was a teenager, part of her duties there were helping to care for younger children. And he was a little boy, and he was one of the children that she helped to care for when she was a teen. And it was years later then, after she had married and had children and parted from her husband, that they met again. And that is where my branch of the family comes from, I guess. Mine is a boarding school family with a couple of generations of families where the children were removed from home and sent somewhere else to live while they went to school. And their schooling was on the assimilationist model, which means that the primary purpose of their schooling was to assimilate the children into larger American society. This was considered to be a very progressive idea at its time. And so the progressive folks of those number of decades there felt that this was a kinder, gentler, and ultimately more effective way of approaching what has been called, and you don't hear it that much anymore, but if you've ever heard the term the Indian problem, that was supposed to be one solution to this, that was going to be an improvement over out and out genocide. It didn't really work. We never really were assimilated in the way that was intended. But also what didn't work was that schooling really wasn't effective for a lot of the children who attended either. So they received often an inferior inferior schooling in majority society, and also experienced a great deal of damage that is still with us today. So that's become what I really start from in much of what I do. When I was in my mid-30s, I think, I got a job at UMD, University of Minnesota Duluth, in the College of Education. I'd moved down there from the range where I had been a parent and then worked in Indian education programs that were really new at the time. And so I worked in Hibbing Public Schools as I was a parent committee young mother, and then I started to work there and then became their director of Indian education. At Hibbing Community College and Hibbing, what was the Hibbing AVTI, the vocational school at the time, started a new program in the Arrowhead region called Services to Indian People. And I went to work there as the first person in that program and was there for a few years too. And then we moved to Duluth. And I was born in Duluth, and we're happy to come back to Duluth. So I was there in those really early times of when there were some federally funded programs that gave us a feeling of being acknowledged and respected and supported in continuing a type of education and existence that had been really so badly hurt by federal and state Indian policies over a long period of time. In Duluth, as the secretary in student affairs in CEHSP, the College of Education, I went back to school and finished my schooling. I finished a bachelor's degree and a master's degree and a doctoral degree. And eventually, it all sounds so easy, it actually was very hard. Eventually, after a while there, became a faculty person in the Department of American Indian Studies. And I retired from there something over a year ago, though I still do some things that to support the education of Native students, but also of non-Native students in doing my best to provide some support and strengthening, but also a bridge and a friendly Indigenous hand. When I was going to school at night school at one of my aunts was very excited that I was going to go to college, and she began to call me. I was at a powwow in Duluth, and we were talking one day, and she was very excited about this and was telling me to be sure to be true to us and to always remember and honor what who we are and what we are, where we came from. And she said, and don't let them chase you out of there. And her words, I have stayed with me ever since. Education, formal education can be kind of a difficult setting for many Native people. But her words, and she's long gone from this earth now, but her words actually strengthen me, and I use them to help strengthen other people. So she talked to me about all kinds of things over several years. And one of the things she wanted to talk about that was very important, she wanted me to know about the Indian boarding school system. And she wanted me to know and about where our family came from and how we came to be where we are. I wondered, why she would choose me to do this. And it kind of came to me at some point that she knew that she wouldn't live forever, and that she wanted me to survive, to continue the story, to remember it, to share it in appropriate ways, and to then pass it to others who would take good care of these family stories and then pass them on. And so that's what I've been doing. My first book, The Dance Boots, was published in 2010, and I was 59 years old when it came out. So it's I hadn't been publishing stuff, like ever. And I was really very surprised and just like kind of, that isn't even the word, flabbergasted. I'd begun to pull some of my stuff together and submit it to different places where I saw there were calls for manuscripts. And when I got an email one day, the header was Flannery O'Connor Award. I've been sending my stuff out, and I'd been rejected, as anybody who's writing, who's here with us this evening, you just get rejected all the time. But I opened it up and I told myself I will be happy for the person who got this. And then it was me. That first piece I did is a collection of 8 stories. They're linked stories, so they really read like a novel. And it is about an extended Ojibwe family with a lot of mixed blood people in there, and their experiences over about a century, beginning with an Indian boarding school and then bringing them up through contemporary times. I have all my books here, so this is what it looks like. And I started the first story here is actually the last one I wrote, and I wrote it shortly after my aunt's death. And it was because not all that long before she died, she wanted to give me, me and my dad went over to visit her, and she wanted to give me her boots that she wore to dance in at powwows. And she thought that, she thought I might do that. And she had a good idea that, I could continue that tradition. And so just that object is what began that story. I've written fiction, nonfiction, articles, essays, poetry, and there's quite a lot of formal research that goes into what I've been doing, but also the type of research that I think is really indigenous. And I think back to like William Warren's History of the Ojibwe Nation, where he actually got information from older people who were sharing the stories and the histories with him. And in reading that book, I remember it was the first Indian studies class I ever took, and it was from Kent Smith at Bemidji State, and it was so exciting for me to when Kent showed us where paper research and oral histories coincided in that book. And it was one of those moments, where your world just kind of rocks, and you realize that, yes, indeed, William Warren was doing this, a long time ago, and that methodology, I guess you might call it, was true and good, and it can be true and good today. And so that also encouraged me to go in the direction that my aunt and a few of my other relatives too were encouraging me to go. They were, it was a couple of my aunts and several of my uncles, my dad, who really began to talk with me about things that I think they wanted to be kind of in a repository, me, and not kept, not locked up and kept there, but put to the purpose that they were intended. It's the destiny of Ojibwe people, maybe of all people, to do this. I've enjoyed writing fiction because when I wrote my dissertation, I did an oral history project and interviewed a number of people about their boarding school experiences. And what I was looking for is, what's your experience? Do you think, in what ways do you think it has affected you and the generations after you. So I interviewed people who had attended boarding schools, mostly in Minnesota. I interviewed people from northern part of Minnesota, northern half, and some had gone to school in Canada. Let's see, where else? At Haskell in Lawrence, Kansas, and some of the schools in Wisconsin. And so I was asking them about this, and I asked some of their descendants also while I was at it, because their perspective, I think, was important in this research, and also was important to the people who themselves had gone to a boarding school, to see how their descendants felt about this. And I think, to make them, to, I guess, underline, to emphasize that basic collective survival of Native people, and in this case, mostly Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people, that the will to survive is beyond the individual. And when I use that word collective, we're thinking of family, community, of a people, and that your survival is not for yourself alone. It was hard to do. The interviews themselves, this is in days of tape recorders. And so I actually was able to find a dictaphone machine from the ROTC program at UMD. They dug one out, said, here, we have one, because I wanted to do the transcripts myself. And so I typed them myself, and then had them so I could have a method where I could actually see them. They would be at hand. They would be physical and tangible, besides being able to hear them. And it was hard. The people I interviewed never cried, even though some of their stories were so sad, but they never cried. And I did while I was typing for that. It took me like about 6 months to do that. And then when I'd finished, I realized that, this is, I'm crying, but that isn't my job here. That's not my purpose. My purpose is something else, and how to share this. I never published my dissertation. It exists, I know, but I began to turn my own experience into fiction and into essays. I just found it was easier to do it that way. So I just kept on doing that. So I have a few more fiction books, and I had, what did I have? I wrote about, my first fiction was about boarding school effects on a community. The second one is called, I don't have that one, is called The Road Back to Sweetgrass. And and it all takes place in northern Minnesota, northeastern Minnesota primarily. And so The Road Back to Sweetgrass then has a different focus. It is on mostly young women who were born on the cusp of what was called the termination era for Native people. And that was the actual name for the federal policy, was termination, after the Second World War. So these are children of boarding school people. After the Second World War, termination meant the termination of American Indian tribes as sovereign bodies, well, as existing at all. And so through a number of federal programs, the Native people, the big plan was eventually would probably just disappear, would melt into larger American society. And I know that one of the men that I interviewed when I was doing boarding school stuff had been his mother had been a boarding school child, and he'd been a termination young person, and he had been relocated to a town far away, where he was going to vocational training. And the idea was he would never return home and see his family. So, that's, he wanted to point out to me, he said, the relocation programs and the termination programs were the same thing as the boarding school era, the same thing, designed to assimilate Native people into a larger society and have them just plain disappear. He said the same thing. And, certainly that was eye-opening to me. So my second fiction book then, after talking to a few people and doing a little research on termination, and these are, a lot of people are, around my age, I wrote then a fictional story about some young Native women from the same fictional area from the dance boots, who had come of age right on the cusp, or they'd been born right on the cusp of termination days, and had become young women during that time and experienced some of those programs, the relocation program, the Indian adoption project and all the projects connected to it, and also the mass sterilizations of mostly women, but not all women, of Native women in the 1970s. And so it's a fictional work, but I put real, these are things that certainly people experienced in there. So my third fiction book then, that one I have, is called In the Night of Memory. And then this is another generation of that community in northern Minnesota, northeastern. And so this would be children of the girls of the second book, grandchildren of the people of the first book, and they experience times like in the 80s and 90s and later. They experience changing times. They're mostly urban. They are seeing some Indian education programs begin to pop up. They're seeing a strengthening of tribal sovereignty. They are little children during that pivotal year, 1978, when the Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed, when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed. And so they're living in a whole new world, but they're experiencing people still pulling things together from before. And so I started writing about, I thought I would write about a couple of little girls who are sisters who are in the foster system, but it expanded beyond that as I was writing and began to address some of the things that have been so common in Indian country all my life, but have only been in the media recently, and that is that of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that became a part of that story also. So yeah, it is a difficult, as Robin said, painful past that we deal with. But in the middle of that, there is the great gratitude for being a Native person, for being created as a Native person, and I remember that all the time in whatever I'm doing. And certainly, just like people were telling me, not every day at boarding school was horrible. Not every experience was horrible. There was the funny time that we did this, or the time that at Christmas when a guy gave me a box full of cookies. So there are things like that in our history too. Essays. I enjoy essays and nonfiction. Onigamiising is sort of a memoir essay, creative nonfiction. It received the Minnesota Book Award a few years ago. And as a person who lives in Duluth, I began to write a column for a free paper some time ago, probably 15 years ago. And I would write a column every month just about, I don't know, as a Native lady who lives in town. And I wrote about all kinds of things, about social activities, traditions, our language, education, food. I started out with a fry bread recipe on my first column. The editor said, "Well, what would you write about?" And I said, "Well, I would share my recipe." And so I wrote about that for a while, and then eventually combined, they were real short little columns in the free paper. It's called The Budgeter. I live in the western side of town. It's called The Budgeter. On other parts of town, it's called The Budgeteer. But to me, it is The Budgeter. And I wrote until the paper ceased to exist as a paper with columns a few years ago. And so these essays, a lot of them were combined, expanded into a seasonal theme here. Seasonal as far as the weather goes, but seasonal as far as years go, and a person's life, my life or your life, and also seasonal as far as the existence of human beings and the earth and all who exist here. It's I enjoyed putting that book together. Robin showed you the cover of Gichigami Hearts, which came out just last fall. Of all the stuff I've written, this is probably the most that is me, autobiographical. It is in several sections. The subtitle of the book is Stories and Histories from Misaabekong. And Misaabekong is one of the words for this area where Duluth is. You know the book Onigamiising? That's one of the words for this area. Onigamiising in Ojibwe language means the place of the small portage. And it refers, I believe, to that that strip of land that sticks out from Duluth, where, Park Point, the beaches are, and boats and stuff. That was a very easy portage in the old days, and a very easy short one. When you're traveling on water, you unload and then carry your stuff a short distance, and then, go back in the water. It was short and easy. And so that is what Onigamiising was, to identify that place of where the living is easy, I guess. Gichigami Hearts. Gichigami is a name for Lake Superior. I hear some people call it the Great Ojibwe Sea, which I think is so beautiful. Stories and Histories from Misaabekong. Misaabekong means, in Ojibwe language, the place of the giants. And, there are other places in the country, I know, that call themselves the place of the giants. So this isn't the only one. This refers to giants in a number of ways, but the one that I wrote about is the terrain here in this region, and the really big ridge of gabbro rock that runs from Carleton County, southwest of Duluth, all the way up the North Shore, close to the shore, and sometimes right at the shore, all the way up into Canada. That giant ridge. And in some places, there are outcroppings right up to the water. And in Duluth here, there is an outcropping right in the center of town. And we've called it, as long as I know, the Point of Rocks. And maybe you've heard of it. It's on about 7th Avenue West. I know the center of Duluth, when you're numbering the streets, is Lake Avenue. But really, when I'm looking at Duluth, if I'm looking at a map, I can see that this large outcropping is at the center, and that there is a symmetry to Duluth on a map. Duluth has many streams that run down into Lake Superior. And looking at some of the really big ones, I can see there's a symmetry in their distance from the Point of Rocks. And how did it come to be that way? Was this a large plan? And we don't know. There's nobody here to tell us, and maybe someday we will understand and know that. So I write about Duluth then. I write about the Great Ojibwe Migration from the eastern part of this continent, like Maine and north of Maine and Newfoundland, Oh, that area that which is it's a religious story and a religious journey where people moved west and moved to where we are generally today, following a route, kind of roughly along the Great Lakes. And and there were stopping places along the way and places where people settled. And this was by vision. And there are, several versions of the story of that vision. But what it did was it brought us through dreams and through the prayers of the holy people, brought us to where we are now. One of the stories is that people were told in a vision that they were to come to a place where there would be food growing right out of the water, a miraculous thing that was going to be provided, to have faith and that the creator was going to provide this. And sure enough, in many of the places, then that's where there is a wild rice crop that people still harvest every year. It's a miraculous food that grows right out of the water. Who would have thought it? And so that is wild rice, then, Manuman, is a sacred food to the Ojibwe people because of that. When we eat it, I mean, certainly you just cook it up and eat it. But we are always, I think, aware that there is that sacred story about the journey and about keeping the faith and always being optimistic, I think, and hoping for good things and watching for the good things that can happen. Some of my family were at Madeline Island for a while in northern Wisconsin there, where the Apostle Islands are. That was for a time a very large gathering place for Ojibwe people. And then the fur trade came in and things changed greatly. But during that time, and what I've heard is that was like, somebody said it was probably like about 125 years or so, and that it's been called by some people the golden age of the Ojibwe there. It was a time of peace and great prosperity for people. And, it didn't last forever. Sometime around in the late 1830s, before the fur trade really died out, two young people, great grandparents of mine, traveled from Madeline Island, by Bayfield, Wisconsin, and traveled over to where the fur post was at the far end of Duluth, Minnesota, and the fur post was dying right about then anyway. But they went there to make their fortune, a young couple. They were actually married by Bishop Baraga, the missionary at Madeline Island, and they made their way here, and they were going to make their life here, and they did, and they settled in the Fond du Lac area, the one at the far end of West Duluth. This is before the 1854 treaty and before the movement of people to the reservation lands that we have now. And so they worked there and had children. The guy worked the fur trade. It's amazing the kind of traveling that people did in those days. He actually worked up at Grand Portage sometimes, and that's quite a trek to make. But he went up there and he worked up there for the fur post. He became a fisherman and, providing food for people up there. He was, like hired labor to do that. They settled then, their family in far west Duluth. And that is where I think many of the roots of a lot of the people around here are, that far west Duluth area of Fond du Lac. One of their children then married a man who brought her to the UP, Michigan, and then her mother ended up in far north in the what became the lands of the Bois Forte band of people, and married somebody up there. And so in all this movement over all these times, there are Native people traveling, you know, pretty freely, though there was a great encroachment of settlers coming in. There was the fur trade. There were in some parts up here, was the lumber companies were coming in. So people were really kind of being squeezed. But it was with the 1854 treaty, and there were a series of treaties that were land cession treaties, the ceding of land away in exchange for the promise of maybe some money in the future, food, some goods, a plow, a seed, fabric, pots and pans, tools. But the idea was that land was being ceded away, and then some was going to be ceded back to that band, and that was going to be reserved for them. And that was that's what a reservation is that land that was ceded back in that way. And so there was great change that went on over a, you know, not all that long a period of time in history. So when you think of 1854, and in some parts of the country, there had already been some efforts to deal with remember that Indian problem, to deal with that by schooling. And it was mostly missionaries, but sometimes whatever government was in charge at the time would attempt to assimilate children, to school them, to see if perhaps people could be taught to read and write and could become a part of supporting a society that was going to be growing. And so the missionaries established a lot of these schools, but it was after the Civil War that the boarding school system really began to grow. And Colonel Pratt, who had worked with soldiers who were dealing with conflicts with Native people on the Great Plains, after the Civil War, had the great idea that Native people could be schooled and educated on a very, very large scale, a federal government scale, and that this would be a kinder way to deal with the big problem. He started the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is, you know, near Gettysburg. And that was the first really big federally funded boarding school. He was a very effective public relations person and was able to work with a lot of groups of the progressives at the time, churches, temperance groups, women's suffragist groups, and he was able to garner a lot of support. And so the federal boarding school system became how Indians were going to be dealt with. Now, not every child went to boarding school. These things couldn't go up fast enough. You couldn't just have boarding schools. So it took a while to build them. And so some children, were going to school on little schools at home, some mission schools at home. Some were going away to boarding school, and so the education was spotty. Sometime in the 1880s, education became compulsory, and so they had to go, and that made tremendous changes in Indian country too, because their parents, if they did not send them to school, were breaking the law. To further sweeten the deal, in some communities where on reservation lands, many people didn't have access to the sustenance that they'd had before, the hunting, the fishing, the farming, the gathering. And so they were living on commodities provided by the federal government. One way to encourage people to send their children to school was to only provide commodities for, say, everybody over the age of 18. And so there just wouldn't be enough to feed everyone. Parents were told, your way of life is dead. It's done. It's over now. It's over for you. but what you can do is save your children, and this is how. And so, you know, in movies, I guess, you know, we're led to imagine, and I know this did happen, you know, scenes of children being torn from their mother's arms, and everybody just really, you know, just a heartrending, horrible, horrible situation. But often the situation was they had no choice. You just had to do it. And that is something that my uncles, my dad's brothers, really wanted to stress to me when they were talking to me. Many times they're talking about boarding schools, and they would say they didn't want me to think less of their mother for allowing this to happen to her kids. And so they would say, you see, they had no choice. And, you know, to me, that was one of the most difficult times, you know, because, you know, they have such, you know, they had great love and reverence for their mother, and they wanted me to also. And of course I do. I mean, I can't imagine myself being in that situation, living in a community where there just were no children, and you know, your own children and grandchildren where they weren't there. So I know I've been talking for quite a while here. I should probably stop. In the late 60s is when, after the termination days and all this, after the Second World War, after the boarding school era began to be closed down in the 1930s. It took a while to close it down because you can't just unbuild Indian schools. Where are these kids going to go? But when I was expecting my third child, and I walked into my kids were, I don't know, they were doing some fun thing in summer school, and my two older girls, they were little, and I saw a woman I know, and she said, oh, you know, there's an Indian education program here. And I said, what? And she said, yes. She said, and right down here, she introduced me to the woman who was working there. And she said, yes, we have a parent involvement committee, and we meet, and we're learning to do things, you know, with our kids. We're learning to make ribbon dresses, and we're going to have a powwow. We're going to have an occasion for the children, and they will wear their dresses and their vests that we're sewing for them. And I began to go, and have been so thankful ever since. It was, you know, it was just one of those wonderful days. I can still picture it, you know, me waddling around and meeting people who are showing me that there is a good thing happening here for Indian children and for all of us then. So I think I'll pause here. I think if people have questions, that they're going to go into the box. But I can see one here. Did my aunt ever know that I was a published author? No, she didn't. She died, I don't know, a year before that first book came out. She knew I was working on stuff, and she and my uncle were very excited about this. They felt like I was really doing something important, and they wanted me to tell a story. So no, she never knew, but she's with me there in every book, and so are my uncles. Any other questions from anybody, or should I?
I wonder, Linda, if I may, it seems that there is one of the cases that is on the docket for the U.S. Supreme Court in this coming term could possibly overturn protections that Ojibwe and other Native Americans in Minnesota had gained about protecting their children from adoptions. The case was called Brackeen versus Holland. Do you know anything about that? And are people concerned about it in your community?
Is that about overturning the Indian Child Welfare Act?
Yes, yes.
I've heard of this. I haven't heard a lot of it. There have been a lot of challenges to ICWA over the years, and there are and certainly there have been a lot of custody battles in court. ICWA it's not perfect, but it is what we have. And what it has done, and this is my opinion here, is that really it has strengthened tribes and the sovereignty of tribes. So when we're thinking of Indian Child Welfare Act, people challenging it and the Supreme Court, overturning it, it's like, what? Flawed though it can be, it certainly. And it has not worked 100% of the time for everybody, but then what does? So yeah, I did hear about that. I haven't heard this gathering lots and lots of rolling thunder, though no doubt it will. But there have been many challenges to ICWA, and sometimes I have seen decisions that I myself might not necessarily agree with. And I also think I'm really happy that I'm not the person who had to make that decision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Amy has put in the chat that a request that you read a little bit to us. Have you got a dog-eared page or a page with a bookmark in it that you'd care to share with us?
That I would share?
Please.
Yeah, I can do that. I've written a lot of fictional kinds of things, and I think I'm going to read a little bit out of In the Night of Memory, a little bit from the beginning. This book is about a missing Native woman, but it is also it's about her children and about the foster system. And it is also about the strength of Native people and the great comfort and strength that we take from our history and our traditions. So this is being told by a girl named Azure, and she has a sister named Rainy. Our mother, Loretta, gave us the most beautiful name she could think of. She gave us a memory, one that I have told to Rainy so many times that to her it has become real, though I wonder if it never happened at all and is only one of my dreams. And when Rainy was 4 and I was going on 3, our mother gave us to the St. Louis County foster care system. It was the same year that Duluth's mining heiress Elizabeth Congdon was murdered by her daughter and son-in-law. The crime was spectacular, and although it happened decades ago now, it is still talked about around town, and every time it comes up, I think of my mother. She and Miss Congdon, whose lives never intersected, are linked in this single way. Rainfall Dawn and Azure Sky are our real names, the ones Loretta wrote down for our birth certificates, though she called us Rainy and Azure most of the time. When she wanted something or was stressed or had been drinking or all 3, we were baby and sister. Rainy was baby because she was born first, and I was sister because I came second a year and a half later. Nobody has called us baby and sister since the morning Loretta was getting us ready to go on that cab ride to the county. We haven't seen or heard from her since, I think, though I'm not sure. Although Rainy and I have forgotten Loretta's face, Rain occasionally thinks she sees our mother in the gracefully bending woman at the butcher counter whose long hair sweeps to the side as she looks at a tray of pork chops. She might see her in a traditional dancer wearing a dark blue calico dress at the Mauger Point Spring Powwow, who, turning to face the flags during grand entry, is in fact our Auntie Margie. Or in the bundled up homeless woman picking aluminum cans from the trash barrel at the bus hub in downtown Duluth. And I've forgotten our mother's voice, yet I still hear her husky whisper from the night she woke us to see the northern lights and watch her dance. And it is that memory that I chose for us to keep, whether it was just a dream or really happened. And so my mother still whispers to me when it starts to rain and drops of liquid quench the thirst within the sparse leafiness of the old maple tree in the front yard, the wet patter deepening on saturated leaves, rolling water under the dryness of exposed roots. She whispers to me in the absence of rain, on days that the wind picks up and scatters dried leaves across the sidewalk, in the breaking of a city bus, or in the weighty freedom of the northern lights in the night sky. Sometimes I hear her all day, and at other times not for months, and I think she is gone for good after all. And then once again she whispers, and in the air grown warm and damp with her breath is what I had forgotten, the perfume of cigarette, the yeasty sweetness of white bread and red wine. Azure sky, sister, rainy dawn, baby. So that's the beginning.
Thank you. That was lovely, Linda. It's great to hear your writing. Thank you.
Thank you.
How about some questions out there, folks? Or thoughts?
I share a story in Gichigami Hearts that I don't know where it came from. And in Ojibwe stories, a lot of these stories are creation type stories about how the world came to be and how it came to be the way it is today. But there's a lot of other stories too. There are, love stories and ghost stories and funny stories and like what in the world happened stories. But there is something that's so brief that I heard so long ago and had kind of forgotten until I heard somebody mention it a few years ago again. And that is that the Point of Rocks, the big outcropping in Duluth, has been blasted out a couple times because in cutting Duluth in half like that, the street, Superior Street, has had to kind of curve all around this. And so twice during history times, once probably, I don't know, when Duluth was really a new city, and then once again in the 1920s, somebody decided they would just blast it out and they'd be able to widen and straighten the street. And East and West Duluth would just go back and forth right in front of the Point of Rocks. Well, it never worked. And even though if you drive there and take a look, well, there are some apartment buildings in there now in the last 25 years. But if you take a look, you can see there's a lot of greenery in there and a lot of swampy stuff. And there's a lot of big rock cliff things that go up quite high. And there's trees growing out of there and stuff like that. In around the turn of the century in 2000 or 1900 or so, in that first blasted out part, immigrants to Duluth settled there, Italians did, who were not at that time welcome in some other parts of Duluth, and so settled in that place. It was called Little Italy at the time, and it's had some other names since then too. Now it's called Glen Place, or some people who used to live there when they were kids call it the Glen. Sometime during that second blasting, as people were working on this, and there were guys dynamiting and stuff, they blew up a part of the rock, and from that part of the rock, an Anishinaabe man, a native man, appeared, and people were surprised. He was dressed in very old-time clothes, I heard, and he looked around, and then he walked away, and he walked to the west, I believe. And it was such a curious story. And who was that, and how did that happen, and where did he go? But another story that connects to that is odd to me too, is the school where I went to elementary school for a while, and some of my family did, was up on the hill, around and up the curve of the Point of Rocks. And the teachers there, when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s, used to say that there, long ago, when the school was still new and the kids were out in the schoolyard with a couple of their teachers, and a native man came walking up the hill, and he spoke to them, and they didn't understand his language.
Mm.
And then one of the teachers talked to him and didn't understand him, thought he might be speaking French. And then the man just kept walking. And I just thought, those are two stories that I have heard. And, I don't know if other people have heard those and felt that connecting of the stories the way I have. But that's a Point of Rocks story. Point of Rocks is still there. And what they ended up doing is Superior Street is widened more away from the Point of Rocks, but nobody's attempted to blast that now in 100 years. Why? It's just not going to happen. Not meant to be.
The lovely story. Mary Helf, you have your mechanical hand up. Robin, can you allow her to unmute and speak?
Mary, you should be able to turn on your microphone.
I'm unmuted now. This is Mary.
Very good.
I wanted to compliment the author. I worked within the court system in this area, in Carlton, Cook Lake, and St. Louis counties. And I was there in the late 90s and early 2000s. When I first read the book, Linda, that you were talking about a little bit ago with Rainey and I'm sorry, can't remember the names. But
Azure. Mm-hmm.
Azure. When I read that book, it changed everything. It changed my view of how the whole system treats Native Americans. And I wanted to agree with you about ICWA. While it may not be perfect, what it did is create a sort of forced fairness where the Native American family, larger family than just mom and dad, became far more important when people tried to figure out what was best for the child. And there's never an easy answer in any family problem, but people were forced to go through the steps to consider things about Native Americans. And when I read about the children you wrote about, I was very happy that ICWA existed. There may be something better, but I would be very sad if it went away without a replacement, because there has to be a way for the Native people to experience some fairness when people are making decisions about their children.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yes.
all.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And yes, in this book, this fictional book, all it took when some people from the girls' extended family, because this family was not, completely organized or anything. When some people from the extended family were able to track down the girls in the system and really wanted them to be placed with them, what they did was they asked the tribe, the fictional Mojay Point reservation government, to please send a letter to the county requesting this and alluding to the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so in this fictional story, the county didn't want to get into a big fight over this, and where they were staying, the foster setting was not was not a good one anyway, and wasn't especially wanting the girls there, and so just kind of gave them up without a struggle. But there are times when, yes, when it's really going to be a struggle like that, even bringing in the Indian Child Welfare Act, even mention it can sometimes help prevail for something that can be good for the children and their families. But man, I mean, you've read some of those court battles that go on with that, and boy, it's heartbreaking. Everybody wants a child, and many people who want to love and care for that child, and the court then has to decide what is the best for this child, and also, though, in the context of the child's it's beyond identity, where they are created, who their people are.
Thank you. And Mary, thank you for the question. Bonnie asked, what's next for you, Linda? What's your next writing project?
My poetry book is being it's revised and expanded, and it's going to be released by the University of Minnesota Press on the 25th of October. And here
wow.
it is. It's so pretty. So the original book was published, I think, in 2016. And this one has a different cover and more poetry, and it's been reorganized and things have been rewritten. And the cover is a painting by Gordon Coons, who is a Le Coudray artist, a Wisconsin band artist. He lives down the cities, I believe. And so this is from a series of paintings that he made. I think it's just stunning. So I look forward to that. I am working on, and I'm working on revisions in a manuscript for another fiction book, and I'm enjoying this one because same region up there, that fictional Mauger Point Reservation in northeastern Minnesota, but some of the people, the story, really kind of focuses on the women who were young women in my second book, The Road Back to Sweetgrass, are now 70-ish. They are elders in their community, and they are in the world today, which to a lot of us is it's so changed and so rapidly changing from so much of what we know, and yet we are like an anchor pin, I think, for some of the really important things in the generations that ours touched when we were young people.
Great, thank you. Robin, do you think we should go ahead and encourage people to reveal themselves and get a little more informal here?
Yeah, we can do that. But before we do that, I want to thank Linda for being here tonight and sharing her words and her writing. And again, I haven't got all the books, but Gichigami Hearts is a beautiful book, and that weaving together of history, poetry, and the stories, the creation stories was just a beautiful, it just flowed. It was just a beautiful story that really touched my heart. So if you can't get it, please get it. And we would love to see you coming up for Eric Dregdy and Vikings in the Attic, where he talks about his family and the creation stories of the Norse. So we'll hope to see you again, but hang on for just a minute. And again, you can see the recording on our YouTube channel. So again, thank you all for being here.